This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina and the Charleston Festival by Historic Charleston Foundation, celebrating houses, history, and culture with tours, concerts, workshops, and more. March 13th through April 13th. Learn more at thecharlestonfestivalsc.org.
And the Florence County Museum, announcing Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson Picturing Justice, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with support from Art Bridges. Johnson's evocative work is on view now through August 10th. flocomuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Alfred Turner, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. This week, Walter, Edgar, and I will be doing something a bit different. We're going to be exploring South Carolina from A to Z. That's the title of our sister podcast, and the title tells you all you need to know about what that podcast does. Letter by letter, we go through the South Carolina Encyclopedia, giving you bite-sized takes on the history of the Palmetto State. And when I say bite-sized, we take entries from the encyclopedia, and Walter turns out a script that is only 145 to 149 words per entry because we've only got a minute for South Carolina from A to Z. So now we're going to expand just a little bit, and we're going to pull some of the interesting ones we've had to do where we really couldn't tell the whole story on a given topic. So a little more in depth, South Carolina from A to Z. So Walter, Edgar.
Yes.
You record South Carolina from A to Z.
Yes, and that's taken from the South Carolina Encyclopedia, more than 2,000 entries.
Right.
And you, Mr. Editor-Producer, allow me 149 words to come
149?
up with. Well, between 100...
We need to cut that back.
Between 145 to 149. Now, that means I have to take sometimes a 5,000-word entry and reduce it down to your limit.
Quel dommage.
And many a time, not all the time, many of the time, you'll say, well, that guy sounds, or that person sounds kind of interesting. Well, Alfred, that person really was. We just don't have time. Or that incident, did you really know? And I'll come up with something that we could not always include because of time.
Right.
And so a couple of weeks ago over coffee, you and I thought, well, why don't we do a show where we talk about some of those things that we could not use because of the time constraint of the A's to Z.
Yes, and for those who listen to this show on a podcast, South Carolina from A to Z is also a podcast. It's in the podcast universe, and you can get it from your favorite podcast providers. SouthCarolinaPublicRadio.org has it on demand, but it is also still a radio feature. So 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, Walter comes on and says, this is Walter Edgar with South Carolina from A to Z, and B is for... And in this case, we are starting with B, right?
Yes.
Okay.
B is for Bates, Clayton, 1907 to 1998, tap dancer.
Okay.
Now, why would that seem to be interesting? Well, Bates, as you know, was a native of Fountain Inn in the upstate. As a young man, and I mean really a teenager, he had to go to work in a cottonseed oil mill to help support his family. His father was deceased. Well, there was an accident, and his leg had to be amputated. So he was given a wooden leg, or peg as it's sometimes called, and he adopted tap dancing steps to his own specifications.
He wanted to dance in spite of losing a leg?
Yes.
Okay.
And you got to remember, this is the early 20th century, and this is a young black teenager. But By age 15, he was established and performed on both the black and white vaudeville circuits.
Now, okay, here's for all you millennials out there, vaudeville or vaudeville, depending on how you want to pronounce it, was a circuit that people toured, and there were various, I think the southern leg of vaudeville circuits, and they went to theaters that were set up for this purpose, where you could get a variety act of all different kinds of dancers and singers and acrobats and comedians and dramatic readings. And was it not called the Chitlin Circuit in the South? I think it was.
Some people did, and then you had the upstate New York, the Borscht Belt Circuit.
Right.
Yes, it depended upon the area. But what's really impressive is, clearly, as a young black teenager, he started out on the African-American vaudeville circuit, but then he was picked up by white vaudeville. And at one time, there was an impresario on the vaudeville circuit known as Ed Sullivan.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. Well, through Ed Sullivan, Peg Leg Bates, as he's now calling himself, got a lot of good gigs, including a tour in Australia.
Really?
Yes. And in the 1930s, besides the white vaudeville circuit, he played the best African-American clubs in the United States, including the Cotton Club in Harlem, world famous.
Which was, yes, that was a big deal, yeah.
But when I mentioned Ed Sullivan, I saw you raise your eyebrows.
Well, again, for folks who were born in the latter part of the 20th century, for those who grew up in my era, I was born in 1955, my family, along with millions, it cannot be exaggerated, millions of others tuned in on Sunday night on television to watch a variety show called The Ed Sullivan Show. So we know Ed as the somewhat stilted and often caricatured host, but who brought in people, again, acrobats, comedians, singers.
Elvis Presley.
The Beatles. The Rolling Stones. All of these folks on American television, and it is hard to exaggerate how America stopped on Sunday evenings for that hour.
What Ed Sullivan really did was take the vaudeville show out of theaters,
right,
and bring it to the home screen.
And I had no idea before you told me that he was a vaudeville impresario.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, Bates may have been on Ed Sullivan's show more than any other entertainer. There are at least 21 appearances over the life of the Ed Sullivan Show.
Wow.
And that's big time.
That is big time.
And in fact, it was so big time in the 1960s, Peg Leg Bates, this young man from Fountain Inn, South Carolina, opened the Peg Leg Bates Country Club in upstate New York, which catered primarily to an elite African-American clientele.
Wow.
He retired in the 60s, home to Fountain Inn, and there he died several years later. But
wow.
This was a young man who overcame his handicap and actually turned it into what brought him fame.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure you'd have to think. I've not seen any clips of him, but I'll bet they're on YouTube. I'll bet they are. And I would think that it wasn't just the novelty of seeing a tap dancer with a wooden leg. He had to be good to be on the Ed Sullivan Show 21 times.
Yes. And those shows, remember, folks, at least in the early years, they were live.
Yes, they were. And then eventually they were taped, but they were all taped for a huge studio audience.
Well, I doubt if they had to semi-censor Peg Leg like they did when Elvis Presley first premiered on the Ed Sullivan Show. The cameras were not allowed to go below his waist.
Yeah, they photographed him only from the waist up because, let's just say, what he did from the waist down was provocative.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you're listening to Walter Edgar's Journal, and this is our South Carolina from A to Z in-depth edition. Let's go to C as for Carolina gold rice.
Yes.
This is a complex story.
This is a very complex story. South Carolina, colonial South Carolina, early fortunes were made off of growing rice for the export market. In fact, it was up until the American Civil War, South Carolina produced most of the rice that was grown in the United States.
Now, am I correct in saying from times past when we've talked about the various things that the early South Carolinians did, they tried just about everything for a crop, did they not?
Yes, they basically had an experimental garden in which let's try this if it works, and if it,
mostly on the coast.
Yes, on the coast. In fact, right after the first landing in 1670, they were trying different things. And ironically, one of the things they tried was cotton, and it didn't work early on. But that was
okay.
But rice did. Two things made that successful. One was the swampy lands of South Carolina were good for growing rice. And the enslaved persons brought from Africa, many from coastal areas of West Africa, who knew how to grow rice. And it was the enslaved labor of tens of thousands of African Americans that produced Carolina gold. Some people have said facetiously it was called Carolina gold because it made a lot of gold for folks. But the name truly comes from in the fall when it's in full, I don't want to say flower, but the husk is there. If you looked at a field, particularly in the afternoon sun, it glinted gold. It was a beautiful sight to see. But that rice had been produced by people standing up to their knees in muck, fighting off snakes and alligators, literally, to produce that.
Well, now, one of the reasons that the South Carolina Lowcountry was so good for rice is because they were able to build a pretty elaborate system using the tidal ebb and flow of the rivers. Is that not correct?
That is correct because, of course, you don't want salt water in there.
No.
But South Carolina's rivers are all tidal rivers, which means that if you build a series of dikes and dams with a sluice, when the fresh water's there, you can let it in, and then you drop the sluice gate, and so that provides the moisture, the water for growing your rice. From the air, you can still see the remnants of these rice fields in coastal South Carolina. Commercially, rice is no longer produced, although there are a few farms that do it just to kind of show it there. At Middleton Place, they have a rice field.
Right. And is not Carolina gold back?
Yes, there are some people who are trying to reintroduce traditional crops, and so Carolina gold rice, certain beans, watermelons, all of those things that go back to the 18th century or earlier, yes, are now being grown in South Carolina, but not on the scale that they were prior to 1860.
Right. And we got to mention, too, the enslaved people who did this work, as you said, hard labor and risky as well. They had an entire culture that they brought with them that not only surrounded growing the rice, but also processing the rice.
Yes, processing the rice. Fanner baskets we use for winnowing to get, when you harvested the rice sheaves, you got all sorts of stuff. But this way, when you fanned it, the good stuff stayed in the winnowing basket and the chaff was blown away.
Right.
Later, of course, it was done with machinery, but this was done individually with fanning baskets. And then the influence of the African Americans didn't cease there. They were in the kitchen that turned rice into all sorts of dishes for which South Carolina became famous, certainly the perlots and that kind of thing. As one historian said, from seed to table, Carolina gold was the domain of the enslaved.
Okay. Well, again, a complex story. As we've often said about South Carolina history, it is complex. It has many sides, some of them not pretty, some of them remarkable when you take a look at it. We're going to keep with the C's. Let's go to the Carolina Eye House. Now, I said to my wife just last night, have you ever heard of a Carolina Eye House? And she said no. Now, she's a native South Carolinian, third or fourth generation Colombian. And no, she had not heard of a Carolina Eye House. And I had not either until you brought in this entry for South Carolina from A to Z, C is for Carolina I House. So what is that?
Well, actually, it's the term of I house didn't appear until the 1930s. The houses were.
Right.
But this is something that architectural historians coined in the 1930s, and it refers to an architectural form.
Okay.
And it was first established in the Midwest in the I states of Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. So they called it the I House. Then, as people got involved in historic preservation in South Carolina, they thought, well, we've got those houses here. And what you're referring to, the distinguishing characteristics are full 2 stories, 1 room deep. There are just 2 rooms per floor. Early on, later on, there would be a central hall, but you went into 1 room, which was kind of the workroom, and there was a parlor on the left, and then there were 2, a small stair and 2 rooms upstairs. It was just 1 room deep. Of course, in the 18th century, it migrated into South Carolina, primarily coming down with folks. The Great Wagon Road were bringing it from the middle colonies down to South Carolina. And it became a very common house form in what was then the back country. We had now called the upcountry of South Carolina. And it was clearly status above the log cabin. Or then when you got a little bit fancy, you might have a dog trot cabin with, open area between 2 small log cabins. And it became a status. You had moved beyond the log cabin stage. And the beauty of the I House, it's a very simple form, but you can decorate it any way you want to. So somebody might have Georgian influence, later on Italianate influence, just with a piece of cornice work or front porch pillars, which initially were just kind of square timbers that could be elaborated into columns. And it spread throughout the Carolinas, and when people began to, in this state, certainly look seriously at preservation beyond the Charleston area, and we're talking now about post-World War II, they said, well, we've got our houses here in South Carolina, so...
So the term came into use.
The term came into use.
Not just the I House, but the Carolina I House.
The Carolina I House. And that form, South Carolina helped populate the lower South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and into upper part of Louisiana. They carried the I House with them. And
as they migrated from South Carolina to those places.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting to me that one of the things about the I House was if you could build one, you had arrived, so to speak.
Yes, and it could be built out of anything, stone, timber. And what's really funny is when people first started talking about the Carolina I House, I was at a convention in the state, a meeting in the state, and they tried to say the I House, it was if you looked at it from above, it looked like an eye. Well, no, that's not. That's not where it came from.
Okay. Set them straight, Walter.
I didn't. Somebody else did.
Well, that's good. I was going to say, if you stop and think about that, when the name I House was coined, nobody was looking at it from the air. Okay. Well, now I want to move on. One thing that you brought out was the name of an artist that you wanted to delve more into, and that is South Carolina from A to Z. J is for Johnson William Henry, 1901 to 1970, painter. Now, let's talk about this man. He had an interesting life, and he certainly had an artistic impact.
Yes, native of Florence. He moved to Harlem in 1918 as a young teenager. Having a black person leave the South to get a better deal, better job certainly was not unusual.
No.
But he took odd jobs before he enrolled in the National Academy of Design, where he studied in New York, and then he emigrated to Paris, where he studied art in southern France.
And that was in the 1920s.
In the 1920s. He married a European, and he stayed in Europe until 1938, when under the threat of the Nazi invasion of France, the couple moved to New York. His subject matter really went from more European-style art to reflecting the African-American experience, particularly of rural South Carolina life and Harlem street life. He was very prolific. In his time, he was not as recognized as he is today, where museums around the world want to have a William Henry Johnson work of art. You may remember a while back we did a show with the Mint Museum in Charlotte, and they talked about modern Southern art.
Yes, yes.
William Johnson figured large in that discussion. When he wanted to refine his art, he came back to his roots in terms of subject matter.
Well, if we can move on, we're in the L's now. Now, this is a gentleman that I knew nothing about, and when you did your 145 to 149 word South Carolina from A to Z on Sir Egerton Lee, I could tell there was more to this story than you were able to say, and let's just say he had a story of the rise and fall.
You can bet your boots there is more to the story.
Okay, so first of all, 1732 to 1781.
A lawyer, jurist, royal counselor. He came to South Carolina in the 1750s. With his father, who was a royal official, and he quickly got a lot of lucrative appointments in government.
Okay.
Surveyor General, which means surveying land, which you could also figure out, this is pretty good, I might take some of that for myself.
Okay.
Judge of the Vice Admiralty Court, which means if he, at a trial, that somebody's ship was found to violate the English customs laws, the ship could be sold and he would get a piece of that. And then he was the Attorney General of the province as well. When he conducted the court, he happened to condemn a ship that belonged to his brother-in-law, Henry Lawrence.
Oh, who was a very powerful South
Very
Carolinian.
powerful person. Well, Henry Lawrence sued him back, and so the judge, as Attorney General, defended himself.
Oh, my gosh. Okay.
Which turned Henry Lawrence, a very conservative guy, into an ardent patriot about the abuses of British power. And things were also a little bit personal because Henry's wife's younger sister was the ward of Sir Egerton Lee, and he took advantage of her in quite a scandalous affair, although there are two sides to that story, depending upon, he always claimed that she caused him to...
It was the woman who gave me the apple.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
An old story.
Yeah.
Okay. But he was loyal to the crown.
Absolutely.
From beginning to end, even as dissatisfaction in South Carolina grew with the rule of Britain, he was loyal.
He was loyal, but he left in 1773.
Okay.
And for those folks who know South Carolina and the Revolution, things were already getting pretty hot here. They had been since the late 1760s. So he decided it was probably a good idea to get out of town. So he got a colonial appointment somewhere else. But in 1780, after Charleston was captured, he came back to South Carolina.
He came back.
Yes, where he was the royally appointed intendant or mayor of occupied Charleston. He died in 1781.
He was, I guess, a slick operator, you would say.
Yes. I should have added, his father was Chief Justice of South Carolina. So,
okay.
And, talk about...
Nepotism.
Nepotism, multiple office holding, all of the things that would be complaints of other Americans about British rule.
Right.
And they were all personified, and the arrogance of royal officials. All of that were personified in Sir Egerton Lee.
Okay. Well, let's move on to, I guess, a more uplifting story, because T is for Timothy Elizabeth. She died in 1757.
Oh, I'm glad you came up with that one. She is one of my favorite colonial South Carolinians. The entry is, T is for Timothy, died 1757, newspaper publisher. Now, that should get everybody's attention right there. A woman in the 18th century is a newspaper publisher. Well, she was a native of Holland, and she and her husband had moved to Philadelphia in 1731. And you think about Philadelphia and publishing, Benjamin Franklin comes to mind, and her husband went to work for Benjamin Franklin, who in 1733 invested in establishing a newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina called the South Carolina Gazette.
Okay.
And so Elizabeth and her family moved to Charleston. After about 3 years, her husband died unexpectedly. None of her children were of age. So who's going to run the family business? Well, Elizabeth Timothy was, and published in the South Carolina Gazette after her husband's death was a notice that the newspaper was going to continue. Please pay your subscriptions, and solicited your continued purchase, because the Gazette is now in the care of Elizabeth, who has 6 small children and another hourly expected.
Wow.
Within a year, she had made enough money with the newspaper business to purchase Ben Franklin's interest, and it now belonged to the Timothy family. And although when her boy became of age, he was officially the publisher, she was still running the family business till she died. In addition to publishing the Gazette, they published broadsides, stationery, they had a bookstore, they published several books, including a collection of South Carolina colonial laws. So she was a wonderful entrepreneur, and certainly not typical.
Talk a little bit about women in business in those days. It was an unusual thing, and wasn't there a term for women who were able to be independent like that?
Yes. Femme sole.
Okay.
But now, in order to be a femme sole, if you were married, you had to get your husband's permission, and then you were officially registered with colonial government as being able to operate your own business, because otherwise everything was your husband's.
Right.
You couldn't operate your own business unless it were approved. And there were a number of femme soles in South Carolina, in Charleston in particular, usually associated with haberdashery or millinery, small general stores, hat makers, and taverns. Because in some cases, the husband might be a tradesman, a blacksmith or something like that, but he legally couldn't operate a tavern.
Okay.
But his wife, as a femme sole, could. So it may have still been his tavern or pub, but according to the law, it belonged to the wife.
Now, when you say in a case like this, the husband couldn't operate a tavern,
that was
just because
he was established as a tradesman. He couldn't run a tavern in colonial South Carolina.
Okay, all right.
Now, if that was all he did, he could. But if he
already had a business,
no, he couldn't do that.
Oh, okay. So in this case, a restriction set up a situation where it was to many families' advantage that if there could be a femme sole in the spouse.
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the most famous involved the Backhouse family. They called it Bacchus. He was a cabinet maker, but their tavern was Bacchus, using the god of drink and frivolity. And we know from the inventory of her estate after she died that Mrs. Bacchus clearly bought her clothes from the leading milliner in colonial South Carolina. We're talking about she was shopping A-list, so it was clearly a profitable business.
Okay. Well, let's go to our final one for this South Carolina from A to Z edition of Walter Edgar's Journal. Let's go to P is for piracy.
Yarg, yarg.
And I was surprised when I was reading the entry in the South Carolina Encyclopedia. I would have had a kind of Pirates of the Caribbean kind of idea about piracy in the Carolinas, South Carolina in particular, and that is, we don't want those nasty pirates. We're going to shoot them out of the water any chance we get. And privateers, they weren't much more welcome, but it's a much more complicated story.
It's much more complicated than that, and we're talking about South Carolina under proprietary government from founding until 1720.
Right.
And pirates were welcome for a number of reasons. They always wanted they had to fence their goods somewhere, which they may have taken in the Caribbean, but they could fence them in Charleston. And they also brought with them hard cash,
right,
which helped the local economy. And if a governor were to turn, or a customs official were to turn a blind eye to the source, something, of course, crossed his hands. He got a little bit. And more than one colonial official was investigated for abetting the pirates. Well, they kind of got out of hand in 1718. Two of the more famous American pirates are actually pirates of the Caribbean, Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard.
Okay, yeah, everybody knows Blackbeard.
Okay.
And many people know Stede Bonnet.
Yes. Well, they blockaded Charleston Harbor. And what they were doing is they were seizing ships as they went out, and if there were individuals on board, they held them for ransom. What they needed, though, they needed medical supplies. And so they ransomed the city of Charleston for medical supplies. And then they got them, and they sailed off. Well, South Carolina sent a fleet of boats up to the Cape Fear area, and there they cornered Stede Bonnet's ships, defeated him in a bitter battle, and brought his crew back to Charleston, where they were hanged. And that kind of ended South Carolina's association with the pirates. But it wasn't just in the Caribbean. Again, South Carolina's always had a Caribbean connection, so the fact that the pirates are part of the story isn't all that strange.
Yeah, we need to remind people that South Carolina, many South Carolinians in the late 17th century, early 18th century, came here from...
Primarily from Barbados.
Barbados, yeah.
But also all of the other English Caribbean islands. No matter where they came from, they were referred to as Barbadians. And even though it's clearly not even the Caribbean, South Carolinians referred to Bermudians as Barbadians. If you came from one of the British islands in the New World, you were a Barbadian. And they became a very influential part of South Carolina politics in the late 17th and early 18th centuries.
When we first had this Barbadian influx into South Carolina, was that solely motivated by trying to find a way to grow something to make money, or was there an aspect of, I bring this up because of some shows we've done in the past about sugarcane in the Caribbean, were they not also trying to feed the Caribbean, who used every square inch to grow sugarcane?
Both. To make money and also to serve as a breadbasket for the Caribbean. Okay. In fact, people think about rice and then indigo and cotton, but the first major exports from South Carolina were meat products, cattle ranching. And remember, the term cowboy originated in the Carolinas from African-American men tending open-range cattle. And so beef products primarily, but also pork. It was salted and cured and
shipped in barrels,
And shipped in barrels to the Caribbean.
Okay. So there is a very strong connection between the British Empire and the Caribbean and South Carolina.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The connection has always been there, although it took a lot of folks in terms of dealing with colonial American history to recognize that, and it really came after World War II. South Carolina is an extension of the Caribbean influence, and that the plantation economy as it developed in the Caribbean was brought here, and from here it was transferred to the lower South.
Okay. So that wraps up our first ever look at South Carolina from A to Z. Again, that is a podcast that you can get 5 1-minute segments each week with a different topic from the South Carolina Encyclopedia. Come your way either on South Carolina Public Radio, or you can get it through your favorite podcast provider. And thanks, Walter. This has been fun.
It has been fun. We'll do it again.
Yeah. We sure will. Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at All Good Books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.